Hello and welcome to another episode of the show. I'm Jenna Morton.
And I'm Tosh Taylor. And today we're going to take you on a journey. A journey that I think a lot of people our age have been looking into these days. There's more and more information coming out about ADHD and ADHD in adults. So today we have a friend of ours, Kelly MacDonald Mason, is with us today. Now, Kelly, you recently had quite the journey.
Yes.
With this. And it didn't actually start with you, right? But things started piling up. So how about you tell us how this all began and where you are now?
Okay, well, basically my daughter Vivian, who's in grade 4 now, when she was in grade 1, she was diagnosed with ADHD. And that kind of happened because the teacher's like, she daydreams a lot, she's not paying attention, she can't focus. And the teacher thought it might have been something else. But I took her to the doctor because I suspected that her father had ADHD. We're pretty sure he does. And I took her to the doctor, and he sent us home with an assessment for us to do and the teacher to do. And so I had Shane, my husband, do his separately. So we had 3 different viewpoints, and the doctor was like, yeah, it's pretty clear there's something going on. And our family doctor at the time, he's retired now, was pretty old school. So he's like, I'm not going to refer you and wait months and thousands of dollars in tests. We're going to put her on the drug and see if it works. And if it works, she has ADHD. If it doesn't, because it's basically like speed, it's a very controlled drug. So he's like, you'll know first day. And first day it was like change, like it acts right away. And so I noticed there was like less explosions and fighting that day, less frustration from her. And then things got better and better. And so in helping her, I was reading more and more about ADHD, especially in girls, because lots of people think of hyperactivity, but girls often present with the inattentive type of ADHD, which basically, to me, I'm saying the hyperactivity is happening inside your head. You're not acting out, you're not a problem. So,
But it's all
in
still
there. So in reading about that, I started going, some of this sounds really familiar, and some of this sounds a lot like me. So, and then, people are sharing more about mental health and everything on social media. So there were a few posts where people would share things, and I'd be like, that sounds a lot like me. That sounds like my house is always a mess. There's this, there's that. So I'd been thinking about getting tested, and I did mention it to my new family doctor, but she didn't really do a lot at the time. So I saw a post that a friend shared for Beyond ADHD, which is an online virtual appointment platform that's in New Brunswick. It only works in New Brunswick now, although I think they're trying to go Canada-wide later in the year. It's private, so you do have to pay, although she told me they are working on getting covered by insurance, private insurance as well. And basically you set up an appointment, you do the assessment before the appointment, and you talk to a nurse practitioner or the doctor. There's a doctor of nursing practice that I spoke to, and she basically said, yeah, you're pretty much a classic case, like from what your assessment says and what you're telling me about your life. And so she put me on the same drug Vivian's on, actually, and I started it. And the first day I noticed like my brain was quiet. It wasn't like, I compare my brain normally to like having 100 tabs open on the computer, and you keep flipping through them so you don't forget something.
That's my life.
And so you're keeping it open, and it's all there, right? Like, and your brain's trying to keep it all active so you don't forget. And then you inevitably do forget because you're too busy thinking about 50 things. And that day, funnily enough, at work, I was backing up some people's accounts, so I had extra work to do. And usually I'm really stressed going, you got to get this done. And it was like, no, I could just sit and go, right now we're doing this, and then we're moving on to the next thing. And I was like, huh, is this how normal people's brains are? I had no idea. So since then I was on an introductory dose, and then it upped, and it's been the same way all along. Like, just things are a lot quieter, easier to do things, easier to think about things, and I'm not like just trying to keep everything at the front of my mind because I'm scared I'll forget.
Right.
So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I can see the wheels turning in Tosh's head.
There's a lot of women who are right now getting diagnosed, and people are kind of saying, oh, it's trendy, but a lot of them are happening the same way I did. Their kid gets diagnosed, they're doing research and realizing, hey, and there's a genetic factor. So if your kid has it, probably somebody in their family at some point does. So it's But like I say, with girls especially, I mean, there are boys who have inattentive type as well, but with girls mostly presenting as inattentive, they often don't get diagnosed because they're not causing a trouble in the classroom. They're not running around being hyper and being disruptive. They're just, in their head, they can't be organized. Like their organizational skills are lacking. There's a lack of like executive function, which is why my house is always a mess. You're sitting there thinking, I gotta do this, but you just can't physically figure out how to get it done. So you just don't. And that's like, that was a big symptom for me and things like that. So with the inattentive type, girls often get passed over in the classroom. And a lot of things that are have been traditionally stereotypical girl traits, a lot of it was probably girls with ADHD, daydreaming, and even creativity, because you kind of think differently. And like, I'm great at coming up with ideas. Executing them from beginning to end is a whole other story. So, yeah.
Well, it just makes you think, like, you know, us growing up in the 80s and the 90s, and it was, like, that's kind of, I think, when, like, the whole Ritalin craze came out, and I can remember a bunch of boys getting diagnosed with it. But yeah, you're right, never the girls, but we were always labeled, you're right, as the daydreamers, or she's in her own head, and I say that about my youngest all the time. She just lives in this fairyland, and she's happy, so that makes me happy. But it makes sense. So now all of these women who were growing up in the 80s and the 90s are growing up now and we're going, whoa. Yeah.
And like my mother, she's like, nobody ever mentioned it. I said, well, they wouldn't have, because even like I was a child in the 80s, so it's like they weren't even diagnosing boys then, really. It was more the 90s that it sort of came along, that it was being commonly diagnosed, and then people didn't believe it was really a thing. Some people still don't believe it's really a thing. But I had no hope. And I mean, I talked fast, I talked a lot. Those are symptoms. I was a daydreamer, I was disorganized all the time, that kind of thing. But
you were also intelligent enough to balance that in a way that it didn't, you know, you don't end up in that trouble zone in school, right?
Yes,
like that.
Because I wasn't overtly hyperactive. Right? So, and you know, thinking back on my life now, it's like, what was my personality and what was ADHD? Because so many things that I'm like, well, that's a symptom of ADHD, but it's, you know, part of who I grew up thinking I was, you know?
And I was wondering about that, like, as you go through this part of the journey now, like, is there, I know some people when they go on different medications that impact the way they act, they almost feel that kind of grief of a loss of a part of them. Do you have any of that, or is it all kind of positive for you?
Mine has sort of more been like what would have been if I'd known earlier, right? If I had been diagnosed in my teen years, for example, and medicated, would I have done better in school? I did okay in school. Would I have done better? Would I have been able to study more effectively for the subjects I didn't like? Because part of ADHD is hyperfixation. So if you like something and you're really interested in it, you can focus on it for hours. But if you're not interested, you're just not interested. Math.
I hear ya.
So that's more, I feel like the medication and that is only helping. And I mean, some people choose not to medicate, and that's everybody's personal choice. But for me, it's definitely making things easier. So I'm not like battling my brain from the get-go. And so yeah, there's more that sort of what would have been possible if I had known earlier. But then I also think back, because a lot of people that have ADHD that's undiagnosed, they have found other ways to self-medicate, like caffeine.
Right.
Because it's a stimulant. So it helps your brain work. And I think back to my teenage years, and I drank Coca-Cola like it was going out of style. And I wasn't the type that it kept me awake really late. Because your brain's using that stimulant, so it reacts a bit differently in your system. The same way the drugs do, right? If you don't have ADHD, they react very differently in your system than if you do. So it's very interesting to think about the ways that people have self-medicated without knowing they're self-medicating, and then workarounds they've found. And that's what a lot of times people get to my age, and I'm on a few Facebook groups, and there's people that still have trouble getting diagnosed because the doctors are basically telling them, well, you've coped this long.
Yeah.
But like the nurse practitioner I talked to, she was like, you shouldn't be coping. You should be thriving. Like, you should be able to do whatever you want to do and not have this impeding you.
Well, I mean, that's what we all want to try to do for our kids, right? You advocate for them if there's something that can make the journey more enjoyable and help them thrive in another way, why wouldn't you
Exactly.
choose it, right?
And that's
and
how
so
I
why
felt.
wouldn't you do it for yourself?
Yeah, and that's how I felt about Vivian. Like, not everybody likes medicating children, but if she physically can't focus on something, it's putting her in an unfair, to sit her in school all day without helping. You know, she doesn't enjoy taking it every morning, and she's like, I don't need it, I'm fine. But, you know, she takes it, and she's better those days.
Say that about vegetables too, so.
And I notice her at the end of the day, if there's a day, say, we forgot to give it to her, or she was sick and I didn't give it to her, you notice the fidgeting starts, and the moving around, and the not being able to sit still, and the talking. Later in the day, it gets worse. So I do notice a difference with her on it and not on it. Yeah.
And do you find that for yourself too? Like, say you forget to take it one day, or it's the weekend and you feel like you don't need to take it. Do you find by the end of the day you're agitated as well?
I haven't missed any, but I've noticed I'm more patient with her since I've been on my medication. And I'm not as tired at night because my brain's not working all day, every day on useless stuff, like that it doesn't need to be working on at that moment, you know what I mean? So I found like I'd be mentally exhausted, and it was like getting worse, and I didn't have the energy to do anything at night, or the executive function to make me do anything at night. So it's like I was not doing anything, you know, useful, hyperfixating on things that were interesting, but it's all because, you know, the dopamine, you're searching, your brain's kind of trying to get dopamine, so it's like, oh, this is interesting, and, you know. So I haven't really missed the day to compare, but I found anecdotally that I feel that I'm more patient with her when I'm on it because I'm getting less frustrated.
Which is huge.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because that was going to be my next question. Like, how much better do you find your house functions now? And how long have you been on it now?
It's only been 2 weeks.
Okay.
2.5 weeks, something like that.
Okay.
So it's been very
Super
recent.
new.
Yeah. But even having your daughter on it, how quickly did you notice a change within your house?
I noticed, especially with her, fewer fights and explosions, you know, and especially, you know, kids hold anything bad that happens in all day. Well, couple that with the ADHD and not being able to process things well. Like, she would come, like, I'd pick her up from daycare and it would just be vomiting all onto me, all her bad feelings. So it's like we both started the night at home cranky and that kind of thing. So since she's been on it, like, she's able to control those emotions a little better.
Okay.
Her impulse control is a little better. You know, she's still daydreamy and she's still creative and all the good stuff, but she's able to focus in school and sit still and think about it and not be distracted by what every other kid is doing, you know. I'm sure there's still some of that, but
I mean, they're 10.
Yeah.
But much more manageable
much
level.
more manageable, and it's like normal level, not, you know, fighting against what your brain's doing. 'Cause they literally can't help it when you have ADHD.
Thank goodness you had that teacher, right? Do you know what I mean? But a lot of teachers these days too, you find that they're not diagnosing. They can't diagnose, but you know what I mean. They're not noticing. They're not picking up, flagging, telling the parent. So that's really impressive because I think that a lot of teachers right now don't have the time or the ability to be doing things like that.
Or the skill set. Like no one's taught them what to be looking for necessarily. They've been taught, you know, if you have a fidgety child, do this, not think about what else might be the cause and that type of thing. And the poor teachers that have, 30 kids in front of them.
Yeah, and especially if it's an inattentive type, they're not causing a problem.
Right. Well, they just, the
so
type
if you
of
don't
kids that have
notice
always
that they're
fallen through the
literally
cracks.
looking out the window, not paying attention and not grasping what you're saying, then you don't know. Like, and if you don't know enough about it, then you don't know. Like, I didn't know all these years, So until I started reading about it. So
interesting.
So if it sounds familiar to somebody, there's lots of resources online to go on, and there's even like online little assessments you can do for yourself, and then you can pursue it either with your doctor or.
Yeah, I was going to say, can we go back a bit to the service you use beyond ADHD, right? So is this something that's accessible to anyone in New Brunswick? Is it meant for adults versus children?
No, it's for anybody. They have children and adult assessments. Vivian had already been done, so I didn't have that experience. But and it's, like I say, you pay and you get a virtual appointment. It was like a half-hour appointment, and you do all the and it's a good idea if you know your blood pressure, because they want that information for the medication purposes.
Oh, right.
Right. And heart rate, like if you know that, there's a space to put that in when you're filling out your forms. Just because if your heart rate's up, the stimulant drugs might not be the best choice, but there are other options sometimes. So yeah, you do a little assessment and send it in, and then you meet with them, and they've already pre-reviewed it. And she's like, I just want to ask you, like, what led you here? And I had put on mine that my daughter was diagnosed. So she said, I see your daughter kind of made you aware of this kind of thing. So I started, much like I did here, talking about, my house is always a mess. I've been a fast talker. I talked a lot. Like my mother, when I was little, used to say, you have to stop talking and slow down. I can't understand you. So, and she's like, yeah, it's pretty much classic. And like she said, at your age, you wouldn't have been diagnosed as a kid because in the 80s, they weren't even talking about it in girls. They thought it was a disease of boys.
Right. Exactly.
So strange to think of now and how far we've come.
Yeah.
And to even try to think what the next 5-10 years will be like now that so many people of our age are starting to look into this and have a better understanding of what might be driving their actions.
Yeah, and it's like things that you just think are your personality or your personal failings. Like, it's like, my house is always a mess. Why can't I make myself get up and clean it? Well, my brain was actively going, well, to clean it, you have to do this and this and this and this and this. And first you have to do this, and first you have to go buy this. And it's like, I can't do any of that.
Yeah, so then, exactly. Then you stop. Just forget it, and I'm going to put this TV show on instead. And then zone out.
Yeah.
So you say that it has some genetic traits.
Yes.
Now that you know that, can you remember stuff from your childhood, from your parents that you're going, oh yeah, wait a second.
Well, I kind of said to my mother, I said, I think I've diagnosed you too. Because a lot of the things are similar. But also an interesting thing, I don't know the connection, but it's dopamine levels. And my father has Parkinson's, which is also dopamine affected. Mm-hmm. So that was an interesting connection I made later when I was reading and going, oh, they're both dopamine things. That's interesting. But yeah, my mother has some traits that I would suspect maybe indicate ADHD.
Yeah.
And again, she never knew, because even back then, whatever, you just bucked up and whatever. So it's interesting to look back.
And it's nice that you're putting so much effort into it too, so that when Vivian grows up and if she decides to have kids of her own, she'll know what to watch for. Yeah. Right? Which I think is incredible.
And we talk about her ADHD all the time, and it's nothing like, she'll talk about it at school. She'll tell kids she has it. Like, she's not embarrassed by it. And I say it's just the way. Oh, and another thing, I've been on antidepressants for a while, and a lot of women get diagnosed with depression or anxiety before ADHD, because ADHD, the symptoms can mimic it or it can cause it, because if you think it's personal failings and everything. And so if you're diagnosed with depression and anxiety, but maybe the drugs aren't doing what you want, or you're still, ADHD is an avenue to follow. So instead of her going through that journey of thinking she's got depression and anxiety, but I was always taking drugs for that. So she saw me taking drugs for my brain. So I'm like, you're just taking drugs to help your brain work. That's all it is. So she's never been embarrassed about it, and we always talk about it, and, and she'll talk about it at school. So other kids go, I have ADHD too, because of course there's a ton. And so she's like, oh, I didn't. She realizes she's not alone. Right?
Yeah, it's a very different world than the one we were growing up in, where even if you did have a diagnosis, you might be the one in the school. Right. Whereas now it is so much more common, and for the most part, people talk about it in that positive. You are doing what you need to help yourself. And that's the conversation that should be happening, obviously.
Exactly.
With everything.
Yes.
Yes, literally everything. Absolutely. So, like you said, you were taking medication for depression and anxiety, but anxiety is another, I'll use your word, trendy thing these days. But I wonder how many people maybe have ADHD instead of anxiety.
And it gets misdiagnosed by doctors a lot, because they don't look at ADHD necessarily first. And the symptoms you might be coming in reporting sound similar. So anxiety gets treated first. So there could be a lot. So again,
well, you say it wasn't until you described that process of thinking of cleaning your house that I kind of put that connection together of how similar it is to that anxiety cycle, which is very similar of you get frozen to do something because you think of the million steps to get there and get frozen by that part of the process. And so, yeah, it is a very similar kind
Yeah.
of experience.
And what I've noticed since I've been on the medication is that I'll just do something. Like when Shane had brought home stuff, I was making a dessert for Easter, and I had stuff that needed to go in the freezer, and I knew the downstairs freezer was full. Well, the upstairs freezer was a mess too. But I just cleaned it out without thinking for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or an hour. Oh, I got to go clean the freezer, so I got to go get the garbage bag. I got to do this. I just did it, took out what was needed to come out, put in what I needed space for, and done. And I'm like, another key is perfectionism. People with ADHD tend to be perfectionists, which means they're procrastinators.
Right.
Because if you can't do something perfect,
Yeah.
you don't do it. And that is a big symptom for me, yeah. So if I can't sit down, so before when I'd be cleaning my house, well, I need 4 hours to clean because I have to get everything clean perfectly. Now I'm kind of okay with just, I can pick up the stuff off this table, and that's fine. I did, but something's done.
Right.
And it's more productive, really.
You say it's that executive function
Yep.
piece, right? Of
Yep.
really kind of understanding your mind and how it's working
Yeah.
to make it work for you, not against you.
Yes, exactly. And the drugs allow that to happen for me. Yeah.
That's a really interesting way to go about it. I'm really, really, really happy that you've brought this up. But also, I wonder the difference in your work, because you do have like a very, very like heavy workload with your job.
Yes.
So is it allowed you to be able to separate things? And I wonder if your boss is like, holy crap.
I told them I was
so much
diagnosed. Well, one thing I used to do is I have a few things that I only go out monthly. So, I'd maybe pick at them a little bit, but the last week of the month was
Would be
when the work
crazy,
got
yeah.
done. So it's like now I'm kind of doing a little bit here and there when I have time, and I'm thinking about it before it's crisis moment. Whereas out of sight, out of mind with ADHD, right? You're not thinking about it. It's not in your immediate deadline. Oh, that's tomorrow's problem. That's tomorrow's problem. And then it's like, oh, it's due the end of this week. Okay. So I found for this month, I've been doing better. And like I say, I'm able to focus on the one thing I'm doing. So I'm not like, oh, wait, I got to go do this before I do that.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, I can focus for an hour on this and then go do that.
Or leaving a bunch of half-done
Right.
things.
Yes.
I'm the queen of half-done things.
Yes.
There's my notebook is like conversations from us from 4 years ago that I will sometimes add stuff to that I don't ever go back to, and I don't ever finish. Yeah. So I get that. I get that. I just, you just think that you're a person that's I just assumed I'm a workaholic. That's kind of what my thought was.
I think that's not a diagnosis that's going to go away no matter if you get another one, Tosh.
Sure.
That I think is generally part of your personality.
Yeah, it's me. All right. We'll wrap up the show there before I start self-diagnosing like I do on every episode. Every single one, I'm like, that's me. I've got it.
That's why we do the show. It's just to help Tosh.
It really is, actually. Either that or make me more of a hypochondriac. I haven't quite figured it out. But Kelly, off the top of your head, do you remember the exact web address that we can send people to?
I think it's just beyondadhd.ca.
Okay.
But if you type in Beyond ADHD, and it's for New Brunswick only right now, so
Way to go, New
makes
Brunswick.
it clear, yeah.
Yeah.
Way to go.
Yeah, it's a doctor and the doctorate of nurse practicing that started it, so I
That's
saw a
awesome.
need and
There's
They're
definitely
filling
a
it.
need.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing your
no
journey
problem.
with us.
Thanks for having me.
It's it takes a lot to get up and talk about something
It's just
so
been
personal.
such a revelation that I'm like, how many other people are suffering what I've been suffering through
Yes.
and don't know?
Yes.
So
Well, I'm sure that they are listening, or someone's listening and going, "Oh my goodness, that's my friend, that's my partner, that's my here. Go listen to this now, please." So please share with the people that need to listen and to watch, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.